Ifra's life was a carefully constructed facade, one that hid years of quiet suffering. From the outside, her marriage to Mason appeared to be one of tradition and stability. They were a couple molded by cultural expectations, bound together by family ties rather than affection. But beneath the surface, Ifra endured an existence defined by restraint. Mason was a man who demanded obedience and control. His presence filled their small home with an air of tension, a reminder that Ifra's desires, thoughts, and even movements were not her own to govern. Over the years, Ifra learned to suppress her emotions, burying them beneath the weight of duty and fear. Each morning she moved through her routines with mechanical precision, careful not to upset Mason's fragile temper. Every word she spoke, every gesture she made was calculated to avoid conflict. Yet, despite her efforts, Mason's dissatisfaction often spilled over, manifesting in sharp words and cold stares. Ifra became a ghost in her own life, her dreams fading into the background of her quiet misery. In this desolate existence, the unexpected appearance of Tariq felt like a flicker of light in a dark tunnel. Tariq was a colleague she encountered during a chance work assignment, and his demeanor was a stark contrast to Mason's. He greeted her with warmth, treating her as an equal rather than a subordinate. At first, their interactions were fleeting and professional, simple exchanges about work deadlines or casual pleasantries during lunch breaks. But as the weeks passed, Ifra found herself drawn to Tariq's kindness, his gentle humor, and the way he seemed to truly see her as a person. For Ifra, this connection was like water to a parched soul. The barriers she had built around her emotions began to crack, and in Tariq's presence, she rediscovered parts of herself she thought were lost forever. Their conversations became more personal, touching on hopes and fears that Ifra had never dared to voice. Tariq shared stories of his upbringing, his love for literature, and his dreams of traveling the world. Ifra, in turn, opened up about her own passions, ones she had long suppressed to fit Mason's rigid expectations. It wasn't long before their friendship deepened into something more. What began as stolen moments of shared laughter turned into lingering glances and an unspoken understanding that grew stronger with each passing day. Ifra knew the dangers of what she was feeling, but she couldn't resist the pull of a connection that felt so genuine, so different from the life she had known. Tariq represented a world of possibilities, a world where she could be free to make her own choices. But freedom always comes at a cost. Ifra's growing bond with Tariq didn't escape Mason's notice. Though he rarely showed it, Mason was an observant man, and he began to pick up on subtle changes in Ifra's behavior. She smiled more often, spent longer hours away from home, and seemed distracted during their conversations. Mason's suspicions grew, and he began watching her closely, searching for signs of betrayal. One evening, Mason's paranoia was confirmed. While scrolling through Ifra's phone, he stumbled upon messages exchanged between her and Tariq. The words on the screen were a dagger to Mason's pride, each sentence a confirmation of his worst fears. Rage coursed through him as he pieced together the evidence of her infidelity. To Mason, this was not just a betrayal, it was a humiliation that demanded retribution. Mason's discovery marked the beginning of a dark and harrowing chapter in Ifra's life, one where the illusion of control would shatter into chaos. For Mason, the affair was more than a personal affront, it was a wound to his honor that only blood could heal. The silence between Ifra and Mason was thick, a suffocating tension hanging in the air as Mason stared at her with a look of pure rage. The phone was in his hands, the evidence of her betrayal displayed for her to see, messages between her and Tariq, words she could never have imagined would end up exposing her darkest secret. Her heart raced as her mind scrambled to find some explanation, some way to explain away her actions. But there was nothing. Mason's eyes were cold, calculating, and filled with fury. Ifra could barely breathe. Her chest tightened as she sat frozen, unable to look away from her husband. Every muscle in her body was screaming to flee, but she was paralyzed by the realization that nothing could save her now. The evidence was undeniable. Mason's anger had no words at first, just a quiet, simmering fury that radiated off him like heat. He paced in front of her, his voice low and controlled, but thick with contempt. He didn't need to say much for Ifra to understand the depth of his rage. This wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a complete destruction of everything Mason held dear. His honor, his pride, his power, everything had been shattered in an instant. And in his mind, Ifra had allowed it to happen. The suffocating silence was broken when Mason turned to her with a cold, cruel smile, the kind that made Ifra's stomach churn. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked, his voice dark. "You've humiliated me, Ifra. I can't let this slide." Terror gripped her heart as she tried to find the words to apologize, to beg him to understand. But she knew it was pointless. Her pleas would only make things worse, and Mason was beyond listening. He was consumed by something darker, something that demanded a price for her betrayal. Then Mason made his demand. The words he spoke were chilling, more horrifying than anything Ifra could have imagined. He would not simply confront her about her infidelity. No, that would be too easy. His revenge would be far more twisted. Ifra would have to carry out the punishment herself, with her own hands. He handed her a knife. The weight of it felt unnatural, like a cruel joke. The blade was sharp, its cold metal glinting in the light, but it wasn't the knife that scared her. It was Mason's voice as he ordered her to use it. He wanted her to cut off Tariq's genitals. It wasn't just revenge, it was about asserting power over her, about showing Ifra that he controlled her body and her every action. Ifra recoiled, her mind racing as she tried to process what Mason had just said. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "I can't." But Mason's face was hard, unyielding. "You will," he said, his voice icy. "You will prove your loyalty to me by doing this, Ifra. This is the only way to fix the shame you've caused." Her stomach turned as his words sank in. She was being forced into an impossible situation, a nightmare that twisted everything she had known into something unrecognizable. Mason's power over her, his threats, and the fear that consumed her left her no choice. If she refused, there would be consequences. Worse, her family would pay for her disobedience. Tariq's life would be forfeit, and she couldn't live with that on her conscience. Mason continued to press her, his eyes unblinking as he made it clear that there would be no escape, no way out of the horrific act he had planned. "You don't want me to hurt Tariq, do you?" he taunted. "Then you'll do as I say. Or you'll both regret it." Each word sent a shiver down her spine, and with every passing second, Ifra's options grew smaller and smaller. She could feel the weight of Mason's demand pressing on her, each heartbeat loud in her ears. The fear, the dread, it was consuming her. But the worst part was that she was already trapped. Mason didn't need to say more. Ifra understood. She was no longer just his wife. She was his instrument of punishment, his unwilling accomplice in a brutal act that she could never have imagined, one that would scar her for the rest of her life. She could only nod, her body trembling with the knowledge of what was about to happen. And with that simple gesture, the path was set. The nightmare had only just begun. The days that followed felt like an endless, suffocating blur for Ifra. She moved through her daily routine as if in a trance, her body numb to the world around her. The image of the knife, Mason's voice demanding she carry out the unimaginable, haunted her every waking moment. The weight of the promise she had made to him pressed down on her chest like an anvil, suffocating her from the inside. Each time Ifra thought of Tariq, she felt a deep, gnawing guilt. The man who had shown her kindness, who had given her a taste of something real, something she had longed for in her marriage, was now in danger because of her. She couldn't warn him, couldn't find a way to stop what was coming. Mason had already manipulated her into this corner, and there was no way out. The meeting was arranged, and Ifra could only go through the motions. She sent Tariq the message Mason had instructed, her fingers trembling as she typed the words. "I need to see you. It's urgent." Please meet me at the warehouse. The message was cold, too impersonal, but she knew that it was the only way to get him to come. Tariq wouldn't think twice. He trusted her, believed in their bond, and she couldn't bring herself to betray him outright with a warning. When the day came, Ifra's stomach was tied in knots. She spent the hours leading up to the meeting in a daze, unable to focus on anything. The thought of facing Tariq, knowing what she was being forced to do, filled her with dread. She tried to imagine a way out, some way to stop Mason from going through with his plan, but the truth was, she had no control. As the sun began to set, she left her home, Mason following closely behind her. They drove in silence, the tension in the car palpable. Every mile felt like an eternity. Ifra's mind raced, but she couldn't shake the knowledge that the nightmare she had feared was finally about to unfold. She glanced over at Mason, his jaw set in a hard line, his eyes cold and unforgiving. When they arrived at the warehouse, Ifra's heart pounded so loudly in her ears that it drowned out everything else. The dilapidated building loomed in front of them, its broken windows and rusted exterior reflecting the darkness of the situation. Ifra swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath, but the fear in her chest was overwhelming. Tariq arrived a few minutes later, just as she had instructed. When he saw Ifra standing by the door, he smiled, his face lighting up in the way it always did when they were together. But the smile quickly faded when he noticed Mason standing behind her, his posture rigid and menacing. "Is everything okay?" Tariq asked, his voice filled with confusion. He looked at Ifra, his eyes searching hers for an explanation. Ifra's heart shattered in that moment. She wanted to run to him, to throw herself into his arms and tell him everything, to beg for his forgiveness. But she couldn't. The reality of the situation held her in place, and as much as she wished she could save him, she couldn't. Mason stepped forward, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You thought you could take what was mine, Tariq," he said, his tone dripping with contempt. "You thought you could come between me and my wife. Well, now you'll pay." Tariq's eyes widened in disbelief. "What is this, Mason? What are you talking about?" His confusion quickly turned to fear as he began to realize the true extent of the danger he was in. Ifra's hands trembled as she felt the cold metal of the knife pressed into her palm, the sharpness of it burning through her fingers. Her mind screamed for her to do something, to act, to run. But her body refused to obey. She stood frozen, caught between the man she loved and the man who held her captive. Mason moved behind Tariq and forced him to his knees, the harsh sound of his breath filling the space. Ifra couldn't tear her eyes away, her whole body shaking with the weight of the decision she had made. Mason's voice broke through her thoughts, cold and demanding. "Do it," he said, "or it will be worse for both of you." In that moment, Ifra realized that there was no turning back. She was trapped in Mason's web, and the consequences of defying him were too great to ignore. As she raised the knife, every part of her screamed to stop, but Mason's presence was suffocating, his threats so powerful that they left her with no choice but to follow through with his demand. The seconds stretched into infinity as Ifra's world collapsed around her, and she faced the most horrifying decision of her life. The air in the warehouse seemed to grow colder with every passing moment. Ifra's hand shook uncontrollably as she held the knife, its cold steel reflecting the dim light above. Her stomach churned, and her breath was shallow as she stood frozen, unable to move. Tariq knelt before her, his face filled with a mix of confusion, fear, and disbelief. He couldn't comprehend what was happening, and neither could she. But she knew, deep down, that the nightmare was already unfolding, and there was no way to stop it. Mason's voice sliced through the heavy silence, commanding, cruel, "Do it, Ifra. You owe me this. You owe me everything." His words dripped with authority, and Ifra knew better than to disobey him. The threat in his voice was unmistakable. Ifra tried to block everything out, her own racing thoughts, Tariq's fearful gaze, and the oppressive weight of Mason's control. But it was impossible. The world around her seemed to blur, every sound, every movement, slipping through her fingers like water. All she could focus on was the knife in her hand and the dreadful reality of what she had been forced to do. "Please, Ifra, what's happening?" Tariq whispered, his voice breaking as he looked up at her, pleading for an explanation, for some kind of answer. His confusion only made the situation worse. She wanted to scream, to tell him that everything had gone wrong, that this wasn't her choice, but the words stuck in her throat. Mason took a step forward, his presence looming behind Ifra like a shadow, his voice low but menacing. "She's doing what she has to do. It's your fault, Tariq. You crossed a line." Tariq's eyes widened with horror as he began to understand. "No, please, don't. Don't." His plea was cut short as Mason grabbed his shoulders, forcing him to the ground. The sudden violence shook Ifra, but she didn't move. She couldn't. The world around her seemed to spin, her vision narrowing, and the blade felt heavier with each passing second. Ifra tried to breathe, but the air felt thick and stifling. She could feel the weight of her decision bearing down on her, the crushing knowledge that she was about to take an irreversible step. She thought of the man she had once trusted, the man who had offered her a glimpse of something more, something real. And now, here she was, about to destroy it all, driven by fear, by Mason's demand, by the terror that had shackled her. "Do it," Mason's voice came again, this time sharper, more forceful. "Now." The command rang in Ifra's ears like an execution sentence. She felt her body moving, but it wasn't her anymore. It was as if she had become a puppet, her strings pulled by Mason's will. As she brought the knife closer, her hands trembling, her mind screamed for her to stop, to throw the blade away and run. But she couldn't. Tariq's eyes were wide with fear as he looked up at her, his lips moving as if trying to say something, anything to stop her. But the words didn't come. All Ifra could see was his face, contorted with confusion and pain, and all she could feel was the crushing weight of the life she was about to ruin. Her hand reached out, the blade aimed, and in that moment everything seemed to go silent. The world held its breath, waiting for what was about to happen. But before the knife could make contact, Ifra's resolve finally cracked. She couldn't do it. She couldn't betray him, not like this. The knife slipped from her hand, falling to the ground with a soft clink. For a fleeting moment, everything seemed to freeze. Ifra stared at the blade, trembling in disbelief at what she had almost done. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She had stopped herself, but she knew it was only temporary. Mason's wrath would be swift, and the consequences of defying him would be far worse than anything she could imagine. "Pick it up," Mason snarled, his voice a low growl of fury. But Ifra couldn't. Her legs felt like jelly, her body numb as the realization of what she had almost done settled in. Tariq looked up at her, confusion still in his eyes, but now there was something else, a flicker of understanding, of horror. He knew what was happening, and he knew there was no escape. Mason's grip on the situation tightened. He moved closer to Ifra, his eyes cold, filled with disgust. "You think you can defy me?" he hissed, grabbing her by the arm and forcing her to face him. But Ifra didn't respond. She was lost, trapped in a nightmare of her own making, unable to break free. She had failed Tariq, failed herself, and worst of all, she had failed to find a way out. And now there was no way to undo the damage that had been done. The silence in the warehouse felt oppressive, like a heavy fog settling over Ifra's mind. The blade lay on the ground, a cold, unforgiving reminder of what she had almost done. Her body trembled uncontrollably, and her heart beat so loudly in her chest that it drowned out all other sounds. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as Mason's grip on her arm tightened, his fingers like iron. Tariq remained on his knees, his face pale, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and disbelief. The confusion that had once been there had shifted to something darker, realization. He knew now that Ifra wasn't the woman he thought she was, that there was no hope left for them. What he didn't know was just how much she was truly trapped, how deeply Mason had embedded himself into her life. She wanted to explain, to beg for his forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come. The shame was too heavy, too crushing. Mason's cold voice broke the silence again. "Pick it up, Ifra," he demanded. His words were slow, deliberate, laced with a quiet rage that made Ifra's stomach turn. She could feel the weight of his anger pressing down on her like an invisible force, suffocating her every thought. But Ifra remained still, her mind spinning. She couldn't pick it up. She couldn't do it. She had failed once, but there was no way she could go through with it. Her heart ached as she glanced at Tariq, who still didn't fully understand the danger he was in. He wasn't prepared for what Mason had planned. No one could be. Mason's grip on her tightened, his hand digging into her flesh as he spun her around to face him. His eyes burned with fury, and for a moment Ifra saw something far more terrifying than she had ever anticipated. She saw the true depth of his control over her. He wasn't just angry, he was consumed by power, by the idea that he could make her do anything, that she was nothing more than an extension of his will. "Do you want him to suffer?" Ifra Mason's voice was low, seething with venom. "You've already failed me once. Don't make me show you what happens when you disobey me again." The threat hung in the air like a tangible thing, suffocating any hope she had left. The idea of what Mason was capable of if she didn't comply filled Ifra with terror. She could see his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening as he waited for her to act. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. She had made a promise to herself, and no matter how much Mason pushed her, she wouldn't become the person he wanted her to be. Tariq, still kneeling, spoke quietly, his voice shaking. "Ifra, please, I don't understand. Why? Why are you doing this?" His words were the breaking point. Ifra's heart shattered as she looked into his pleading eyes, the man she had once cared for more than anything now seeing her for what she truly was, a coward, trapped by the man she had married. She didn't have an answer for him. How could she? There was no explanation for what had happened, for why she had allowed herself to fall into Mason's grip. All the power she had once had over her life seemed to have slipped away, like sand through her fingers. Mason's patience ran out. With a swift motion, he pulled Ifra away from Tariq, dragging her closer to him. The sound of his footsteps was the only thing Ifra could hear now, her breath shallow, her mind blank. She had no choice. She had failed. There was no way to take back the last few moments, the decisions she had made. She had watched her own future slip away in front of her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "You are mine," Mason hissed through clenched teeth, his breath hot against her ear. And you will never forget that he threw her toward the corner of the warehouse, where the light was dim and the shadows deep, before turning his attention back to Tariq. Ifra couldn't bear to look. She closed her eyes, her head pounding, the weight of her choices pressing down on her like an avalanche. She had failed everyone, Tariq, herself, and even Mason in some twisted way. There was no going back. There was no redemption. The nightmare she had walked into had become her reality, and now there was no escaping it. Tariq's desperate plea echoed in her mind, but it was too late. She had already sealed her fate, and there was no turning back.